So there we are. My name is Linda Kvist, and I try to do this every Wednesday, talk to people that have been an inspiration to me in my genealogy journey. And joining me today is David Mittelman. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
Doing good.
Doing good. Great. So the first question I ask every guest is, because a lot of people watching are into family history research, where are you and where did your ancestors come from?
So I'm based in the United States. I'm in Texas. I was born overseas in Russia, and my parents are also from Russia. But on my ancestry test, it just says I'm broadly Northern European. So probably from all over Northern Europe. And I don't know much more beyond that, but that's as far as I've gone.
Yeah, because you got more into DNA than into genealogy, right?
Yes, yeah. I'm better at testing. I work with a lot of talented people to dig into the ancestry side of things once we sort out somebody's DNA profile or sequence.
Yeah, because tell me what you are doing. The topic today is forensic genealogy, and that's your area, really, right?
Yeah. So my background, I have a PhD in genetics from Baylor College of Medicine, and my background has been primarily originally it was evolutionary genetics and population genetics, and then mostly medical for the majority of my career. I started working in DNA testing in the mid '90s during the Human Genome Project. So I worked on the first Human Genome Project. This was in Dallas, Texas. And then I've gone on to do several other projects. I was involved in the 1,000 Genomes Project. Spent most of my time in the academic system. Eventually, an associate professor doing DNA testing research and genomics. And then I moved into medical testing. But more recently, in 2018, I got together with a group of folks that I've been doing the genetics research, including one guy that I've known for 20 years. Since the very first Human Genome Project, and we put together a company called Othram. And Othram is right now it's the only private lab in the United States that does end-to-end forensic sequencing. So we have something that's based on whole genome shotgun sequencing. We sequence all of the DNA that we've got, grab all the markers we can grab, and we use that information to enable human ID. So in cases where you have like unidentified remains. So maybe someone died somewhere and there are remains but no evidence, or to help solve a crime. Maybe there's a violent crime and the perpetrators left some DNA. And so we're the only lab in the country right now, here in the States that essentially goes end to end, full chain of custody from evidence. So people will send us evidence, we'll develop an extract, do the testing genome wide, and then we do everything else. We build. We have a really cool way of building genealogy kits. We search the genealogical databases that are searchable, and then work the genealogy with our in-house team to try to come to an ID, or at least a nearest relative, or to learn something about who this person might be. Again, whether they're a victim or somehow involved in a crime. Yeah,
that's super interesting. I'm sorry, I think I got something in my eye. I'm not crying, but and I think it's really interesting what you're telling us. I'm curious how, because you do this, you try to identify remains to see who the person is. How hard is it? Because if the body has been out in the terrain or somewhere for a very long time, how hard is it to sort out the DNA that belongs to the person and from all the bacteria and other stuff that have contaminated the DNA?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually really hard, and this is why I think there's not enough attention put onto this problem of how do you actually get DNA to a digital form that you can then use for genealogy. And I think that's the real bottleneck, I think, in this forensic testing, because if you have a good genealogical profile and you have good data, then you can work genealogy. If you can't get a good profile, there's noise or there's mistakes. You're going to miss relatives. You're going to see segments that probably should be longer that are broken into itty bitty segments. Now you can't tell if it's a second cousin or a fifth cousin. So a lot of our research and effort focuses on how to digitize evidence, and the technologies that people use, these SNP microarrays, SNP chips that they use at 23andMe or Ancestry for consumer testing, they're wonderful for getting kind of a snapshot of a living person from spit. You can spit into the tube or the swab that you do like a MyHeritage or Family Tree, but they're terrible. They're terrible devices for looking at forensic samples, because forensic samples have a couple problems. One is that, as you noted, especially bones, they're very contaminated. So there's going to be a lot of bacterial contamination, and at high bacterial load, they'll break the chip. What will happen is you'll get a low call rate. Next thing you know it, the letters are not what you think they're supposed to be. The chip doesn't tell you really what the confidence of any one letter is. You just kind of get letters and you hope they're right. And if enough of them are right, you get some kind of ancestry readout. But as the call rate on a chip drops, which is not going to happen ever in a consumer test, but on these forensic samples, as the call rate drops, you'll start to see a lot of weird noise and a lot of things that are obviously not real genetic changes. And that's going to throw off GEDmatch or a genealogical search. The other thing that's wrong with forensic samples is you usually have very little DNA. Sometimes you're lucky. There's maybe an entire body on the ground, a crime's recent. But when you're working on older projects, you might have a little tiny piece of evidence remaining. And lots of things have happened to that evidence over time. So the amount of usable DNA that is available could be very tiny. It could be picograms of DNA. It could be very small amounts of DNA. And the third problem is that the DNA degrades. So DNA in its normal form is nice big chunks of sequence of letters, right? Well, they're not really letters, but but they're big pieces of DNA. And as DNA degrades, sits around, gets exposed to heat and the elements, it begins to break into smaller and smaller pieces. And at some point, it'll break into such tiny pieces that it becomes very hard to do any analysis with it. When you run these SNP arrays, you need a certain length, you need a certain amount of DNA and a certain size, or it doesn't work very well. The same is true for how law enforcement currently do testing. They use a test called, here in the States, we use CODIS. Every country's got their own kind of set of markers. These are based on STRs, so these repetitive sequences, and they can be very long. Some of the ones here in the States, some of our markers are 300 letters long. So if the DNA degrades to a certain point, you'll end up with what law enforcement calls an incomplete profile. Because the DNA gets too small, you can't even measure these larger markers. So the nice thing about what we do at Othram is we have, and this is why we decided to basically do the whole thing in-house, is we've retooled how we do extraction, and we've designed extraction processes that are tuned for ancient DNA, for forensic evidence that's just really non-optimal. And we have a really nice process that we can employ in the lab that allows us to enrich the amount of human that's there. So we can, it's not perfect, but we can increase the amount of human relative to non-human. And what that does at minimum is make the case more tractable. It can be very expensive to sequence a sample that has a lot of bacteria in it, as you can imagine, because a DNA sequencer doesn't care what species you are. If there's DNA, it sequences it. So if you're 99% bacteria, you either can't do the case or you're going to spend a lot of money trying to sequence it. So these are a lot of considerations, probably more than your listeners want to hear about. But there's a lot of considerations that you'd never think about if you or your family member just want to do a swab and see, where you're from, that you have to consider in the forensic space. So if we retooled from the ground up a new way to do DNA extraction, we can get DNA that's usable from individual hairs with no root. That was something that was popularized by Ed Green in California. And if anyone doesn't know who he is, they should look him up. He's a great guy. So he's shown that you can do this from individual hairs. We do that as well. We've worked from really old bones. We had a case, I think a month ago in Missouri. There was a case that we announced a solve for. It was bones that were found a little over 40 years ago on a Missouri farm. And the farm had actually been burned. They burned the field to increase productivity, to oxygenate the soil. And so the bones weren't just 40 years old, but they were also burned. I mean, they were in terrible shape. But nonetheless, we were able to take this evidence, build out a really nice profile that incorporated all of the genome and not just, a couple markers that are used by law enforcement. And with those markers, we were able to then, compute an identity. So anyways, to summarize, there's the extraction, there's a human enrichment step, and then every part of our process, there's a whole bunch of other processes to DNA testing that I won't jump into, but each one has been retooled to take into account the non-optimal and damaged kind of state of forensic DNA, but also the low quantities. So sometimes in academic or like in a commercial consumer testing environment, you have automation that's critical because you're looking at tens of thousands or even millions of people, and some of that automation will fail at very low quantities. So even having to rethink every step of how we do the lab work so that we are able to scale and do more than one sample at a time, but we are able to still salvage when there's like only a tiny bit of DNA left. We've worked a case where we had a tube and there was no liquid left in the tube, but there was probably DNA still dried to the ends of the tube, and we were able to resuspend and salvage the last little bit. So anyways, probably more than you wanted to know, but suffice to say, a good amount of casework is going to have terrible DNA, and sometimes doing the right process will get you data versus no data. Sometimes you'll get data, but the data is just bad. And I really feel like the genealogy is not straightforward. And so anything you can do to clean up the data up front before you hand it to a genealogist seems to me the way to go. You don't want a genealogist to spend an extra several months chasing somebody when you could reveal a very clear relationship that would help them, accelerate, figuring out who that person is. So.
Because you do all the steps, you extract the DNA and analyze it, and then you take it into bioinformatics and make the files and everything, and then you upload it to whatever database. You do all the steps. Yeah.
So we talked about extraction, and then doing the testing. When we get the data back, we're obviously getting raw data that covers genetic variation from all over the genome. So the next thing we want to do is take that data and put it into a form that would be consistent with what you'd expect from a genealogy kit, and certainly make sure that we're able to document the genetic markers that you would expect from any genealogy kit, because that's what makes a search possible. Is you make sure you've identified what's there in that sample that you would see in other people's profiles, so you can do an apples to apples comparison, and we do that for genealogical databases. And then sometimes we'll do the upload. Sometimes law enforcement will do it themselves. Sometimes we don't. We work for another lab that works for law enforcement. But all of our casework, to distinguish from like a traditional genealogy project, all of our casework involves some kind of unidentified person, victim or perpetrator. We don't do like adoptions, for example. So that there are cheaper and easier ways if you have a living person to figure out who their parents might be.
Yeah, nice. We got a question here from, I just want to say hello to everyone who's watching. Nice to have you here, and keep writing comments. That's nice. We have Anna-Karin from Växjö, we have Maria from Stockholm, Åsa from Helsingborg, and we have Kevin who has a question. So I will put up the comment here. And he says, a lot of this sounds like it would also apply to commercial artifact testing. Are these costs prohibitive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of the technology that we've put together in forensics would apply perfectly to artifact testing. Whether and we've talked to some museums that have expressed interest in maybe like testing DNA on an outfit or some kind of artifact. And then of course there's the whole consumer side, right? Folks that may not have all the relatives they want to test, but there are heirlooms or some kind of items or something, maybe a hairbrush. I don't know. I would say the costs are prohibitive right now on the consumer side for sure, because consumers don't have giant budgets to go explore this aspect of family history. But I think the costs are not so prohibitive that they couldn't be used within the scope of a like maybe a museum wants to do some interesting research. So I think that it's definitely not a consumer product yet, but I think that artifact testing would be a natural opportunity for this kind of work, particularly if you can pull out the human component and clean up the sample. It's a good question.
Yeah, because we often hear that people asking, "Well, I have a hair lock from whatever relative," and people say, "No, you can't test it, but keep on to that one, and perhaps in 10 years, that is something we
You can test it now. I just think it's it's just going to be really expensive, and so to your point, that hairbrush isn't going anywhere. And if it was me, I would say, technology is always improving. So I would say perhaps wait a little. I don't know if you need to wait 10 years, but there's not a super cheap way to do it right now. I know people have asked questions about the hair left in a brush. Maybe you have some piece of a tooth, or envelopes. So there's probably lots of different things that you could work with. I'm just not personally aware of a way to do it really cost effectively right now. And I think that could change. Again, like one of the biggest issues is just the fact that if you have bacterial or non-human contaminants, some of the older stamps used animal-based products for adhesives, right? So if you're going to sequence that adhesive in the envelope or the stamp, are you going to get other DNA letters? I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm not a stamp expert, but I'm just saying, like, it's not as straightforward as just saying I'll go test it, because if you test it, you'll get DNA letters. I just, I don't know. I think there's more work needs to be done to determine if you're going to get human DNA letters, and if it's going to be the human you're looking for, and not, the other dozens of people that touched it. So that's the other thing, is that, in the forensic space, I forgot to mention this, but in addition to everything else I mentioned, there's very common to have mixtures. And so once you have mixtures of people in there, and if there's more than one that are unknown, like, it just gets very complicated. You can imagine what would happen trying to upload that to the genealogy database and hoping you get a match. So anyways, I don't want to discourage anyone. I think all of this is fascinating. But if you're going to spend your personal dollar, then be cautious and wait. I would definitely wait for people that have validated and shown that it works, and then wait for it to become cost effective.
Yeah, just looking, I took my first DNA test in 2013, and I think it was 3 or 4 times as expensive as it is today. Just in a couple of years, it's so much cheaper and so much easier for people to do, and better tools to analyze, and it's going really fast.
Yeah, I mean, 23andMe, they started off their pricing at like $9.99 US dollars, so it's $1,000. It's a lot of money. I would have said, at the time I looked at that, I was like, no one's going to want that. Obviously, I was wrong. I mean, they got the price down, then everyone wanted it. It was $300. Now it's $100. Ancestry has a sale. Seems like 10 out of 12 months of the year. It's $59. It's $59 right now, right? On Ancestry.
Yeah, it's
I'm not paid by Ancestry, but that's a good deal for those that want to do ancestry testing. So yeah, $59 is wild. What a cheap price. And so but that kind of pricing doesn't exist for samples that aren't fresh and just out of your mouth. So
no. So you talk a little about this case, about this really remains that found in 1979, I think, and it turned out it was a murder victim murdered over 100 years ago. And tell us more about that case.
Oh, okay. That's another case. We so there was a case. So the guy's name is Henry Lovelace. There's a case. It was out of Idaho, and they had found these remains. Just a torso, so no limbs or anything. They found this headless torso in an Idaho cave in 1979. I think a family stumbled upon it, and I believe decades later they found some limbs. But bottom line is they've sent this everywhere, and we're trying to get it identified. There's a nonprofit organization called DNA Project that had funded, basically worked with some folks out of the university in Idaho, and crowdfunded an effort. They raised money to basically solve this case. And so this is a case where the genealogy was done by Anthony Redgrave and Lee Redgrave. They're stellar genealogists. They do genealogy for Othram, but at the time they were working at DNA and they basically took data. We took the sample and did the testing in my laboratory, and put together a genome-wide profile from what ended up, we thought it was 40-year-old remains, ended up being like 100-year-old remains, and built a really nice profile. And then Anthony and Lee took that with a team of genealogists and figured out an ID. And I think along the way there was an attachment to a Mormon tree, which is always good because Mormons are expert genealogists and they do a really good job, putting together records. And they uncovered this wild story. It was, what looked like it might have been a victim from 40 years ago ended up being this guy that apparently murdered people, accused of dismembering his wife, went to prison, and I believe escaped from jail in 1916 and vanished, wearing an outfit that is very similar to the one that he was found in the cave. So speculation being that he vanished from prison, and then maybe someone caught up with him. Who knows? Maybe someone that wanted to pay retribution to what he had done to his wife, because he was found also, chopped up in a cave. So yeah, it's a pretty incredible case. It's just goes to show, like, you never know what you're going to discover as you begin to look into these remains. And I will tell you, we this other case that I told you about in Missouri, where we identified who this person was, turns out he drowned in the Mississippi River. It's not a homicide. He drowned in the Mississippi River, and his body washed, ended up on land, and then, like I said, accidentally was burned. But I mean, at the time, it looked like it might have been a homicide, and it wasn't. There's other cases where you have some remains, like this guy in the cave, and then you discover this amazing story. So it's interesting. I feel like you're doing a real public good in helping close cases that otherwise can't be closed. I mean, if these cases sit for a decade, like, the odds of them being solved in the next decade are not super high. And sometimes all you have left is evidence that with a little bit of DNA testing could push the case forward. So I think there's a humanitarian and there's like a civic good to doing these cases. But I also think some of these, like this case of this Henry Lovelace, there are very interesting historical and genealogical puzzles and stories to reveal as well. And so it's kind of complementary to the genealogy search you do for your family. It's an opportunity to explore the history and stories of a society or a group of folks. And so I think both are really fascinating. But I'm personally very drawn, which is why I work in forensics, to helping drive things to an answer. So we have another case that we just that the law enforcement just solved using our testing, and it hasn't been announced yet. But the half sister of the person that we identified, she's been waiting 25 years. I think at this point she assumed he was dead, but she'd waited 25 years. She said, praying every night to see if there might be something, some indication of what happened to him, or anything. And so she was very appreciative to discover 25 years later what happened. And so I think you always touch at least one person's lives, sometimes the entire family, when you can identify someone. Even if they were a victim, and you may or may not solve the crime associated, but at least you've identified them. And the same is true when you solve crimes. You obviously bring a value to a victim or their family, but imagine how many other people may have been under suspicion or suspected of a crime. Bringing finality to a case, I think, just brings a lot of good to everyone. It removes suspicion from folks that are clearly not involved. It gives peace to families and to victims. So I love working these cases, because one case can have very broad impact, and then you hear about some of these cases that are being worked that are serial in nature. So even more amazing to be able to get to the bottom of an identification that might connect to several crimes, and if you're lucky, might even prevent future crime if they're still active. So that's always great as well. So those are all wonderful reasons to kind of explore this kind of work.
Yeah, we got a question now as well from Åsa. How long time does it take from start to end in a case like the one with the torso?
So there's two parts. One is, like, we got to digitize the evidence and build the genealogy kit. The second part's genealogy. So genealogy is kind of sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. So depending on the matches that you're going to get from a genealogical search, this case that I was telling you about where the half sister is waiting 25 years, there was no genealogy on this case. I mean, it was basically almost a match to a very, very close relative. Law enforcement sorted it out very quickly. Sometimes you have a case like, where you don't have a close relative. Maybe you only have a third cousin or even a fourth cousin, and it can take a long time. So I've seen some cases get solved very quickly, maybe in a day or two. If you watch CC Moore's TV show, I think on the first episode, she said she solved the case in 2 hours. So some cases can be solved very quickly. Some cases can take a long time. I think it's kind of it's kind of a luck of the draw as to who you're trying to identify and how well represented the relatives are in the database you're searching. But to answer the question on the testing side, that's a little bit more easy to explain. So it's about 12 weeks. So it'll take about 12 weeks. And what we do in that time period is we take the evidence. There's a lot, because we have chain of custody and documentation responsibilities, it's a lot of steps. We photograph as we go, write up reports, intermediate. There's a lot of pieces that we do in a controlled way. But I would say we're probably looking at a couple weeks of doing an assessment of the material and the DNA extraction. I will tell you, in the Missouri case, where those remains were burned and really degraded, it actually took us 2 months just to do the DNA extraction, but usually not, usually some weeks. And then we're probably looking at, a month to do, to get it onto the sequencer and do the testing. Our sequencer is kind of like an airplane. It costs the same amount of money to fly the airplane, right? No matter how many people are on the airplane. So you try to batch. And by the way, that's another thing. In forensics, batching samples is very hard because you can't batch an unknown and a known. You have to use samples that are of similar quality, generally run better together. So it'll take probably a month to get it onto the machine, and then there's going to be a good couple weeks doing post-processing. How do we take that data off the machine, produce a genealogy file? We do a lot of diagnostics to vet it. Sometimes we may need to collect a little more data from the sequencer. So any one path could be unique, but I would say generally from the day the evidence hits our office to the day we can produce a genealogy file for a genealogist, I would say about 12 weeks. And you might say that's a long time, but for example, in Texas, it can take 11 to 13 months to get a CODIS test. So that's your 20 STR markers that search CODIS. So it's interesting because in medicine and in consumer testing, turnaround time is very paramount. I don't think we've ever been contacted by a law enforcement agency that said they were in a rush. These are cold cases. They've been unsolved for 40 years. Yeah. But I would say 12 weeks is probably a fair estimate. Sometimes a little quicker, sometimes a little slower, depending on what it will take. And then once that profile is generated, then there's some more time that can be spent. Like I said, from probably days to even maybe months to solve the genealogy. So it's not this is why it costs money to do this kind of work. It's not trivial, but at the same time, it's not impossible. And I think as the genealogy databases grow, as people opt in, we've built a database, DNASolves. We use GEDmatch. As people participate and help grow those databases, I think it'll make it easier and easier to solve the genealogy side.
Yeah, one thing I follow DNA Geo project. I read about their updates and when they have identified people, and I'm always but I'm not amazed, but I'm surprised how many times that the person that has been identified is not reported as a missing person. Yeah.
That's extremely common. And sometimes, for these older cases, sometimes there aren't good records on what happened. There's even been some cases where people have identified criminals through genetic genealogy that otherwise would have probably been in CODIS, but they somehow slipped through the system. They didn't get tested. So, we're human, and so there's human error, and so it's another reason why genetic genealogy and this kind of forensic testing is valuable, because you can't just rely on a perfect CODIS process or a perfect missing records process. Like, things will happen, things will slip through the cracks. Evidence isn't always clear. Sometimes you report them, but in a different time frame. So, suppose someone goes missing, but maybe they were like on the run and they didn't actually die until later. Those dates won't match up, and there's a chance you'll miss it. So I like forensic DNA testing. I think it makes sense to do CODIS testing and to do other kinds of testing first. See if you can search these databases. See if you can use the facts of the case combined with conventional CODIS testing to put together an identity. But in cases where you can't, I think it's very valuable to reflex to forensic testing, because you may solve a case that otherwise wouldn't be solved, or you may discover, as you point out, that the case was solvable but there was a problem somewhere in the chain. They didn't make it into CODIS. They weren't in the missing database, and so yeah, it's important to have multiple ways to work a case so that you have kind of a checks and balance and a way to correct mishaps or lacking information from other methods.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this database that you also created. You mentioned it, and you have the T-shirt that says DNASolves on it. So tell us about that one.
I really like this T-shirt. So DNASolves. So when Curtis was first embroiled in this challenge, right? He'd built GEDmatch, and people were beginning to use it more widely for non-genealogical, for forensic genealogy, and not just for family tree puzzles. I think there's been this like ongoing struggle of how to do public good, but also reconcile like wanting to make sure people are on board with that. And I think it eventually evolved after a couple different pivots to the opt-in, opt-out model that GEDmatch currently has. But at the heart of it, GEDmatch is a genealogy tool, and it's a research tool for genealogists. So I actually got to know GEDmatch a long time earlier. I sold my first company in DNA testing technology to Family Tree DNA, and this was years before people were doing this forensic stuff. And I joined Family Tree DNA gene by gene. I was the chief scientific officer there, and that's when I first, I had a population genetics background, and I understood medical testing. It was my first time getting exposed to genealogy, and I got to see GEDmatch and learn about all this exciting stuff. And suffice to say, like I'm no expert genealogist, but I love it. Ever since I eventually left Gene by Gene and went on to other ventures, but I always retained a love for the genealogy and everything else. And so I've kept in touch with a lot of the people in the community. I love all of them. But what occurred to me with GEDmatch was that it's hard to have that dual mission. So we built DNASolves at the end of last year as a kind of a response, so that we could build a database that has no genealogical value really. Like DNASolves doesn't have public matching, so all you can do in DNASolves is basically contribute information that law enforcement can use to put together an ID. And so the only reason you'd go there is to work law enforcement. And I had thought maybe that would be a way to kind of solve the problem. Like let folks continue to use GEDmatch for genealogy. We don't have any of those fancy tools, and we don't allow public matching, but we'll basically build a resource for folks that want to put together data to solve identities. Then as you probably know, Verigen bought GEDmatch, and I think they've done a great job kind of keeping it going. And again, having this dual mission of enabling genealogy, but then also enabling law enforcement. And so we've continued to grow our database. But the idea for DNASolves is, there's nothing to do in DNASolves but help solve a crime. So instead of an opt-in or an opt-out model, GEDmatch has the opt-in, Family Tree DNA has the opt-out. We just figured there's no reason to come here unless you want to solve a crime. Makes the consent a little more streamlined. And we're building our own tools that I think will be very valuable in helping law enforcement and genealogists that work for law enforcement to kind of streamline, pulling together an identity. So that's kind of the inspiration for DNASolves. I think you want to have a lot of data. I think you want to have more than one database. And then I think what you want to do is I think you want to enable law enforcement or whoever's working on a puzzle to search across many databases, across many data sets, because the idea is just to get the most data you can from the most databases possible and hope that you'll anchor enough genetic cousins so you can put the unknown onto a tree and then through working the tree backwards into time and then back down, triangulate an identity. And all of that really hinges on having some good anchor points. So having those good matches. And so I think any effort that involves either opting people into existing databases or building new databases and new tools, I think those are really great efforts. And so although our business is really the lab and that's what we should be doing, I just thought it was important to step out and also build this resource. And we will try to take more time to kind of show people what this can do and kind of push the growth of these databases, because I think that's going to be the long-term key to bringing these several months to a year projects down to like projects that could take weeks.
Yeah. So I haven't uploaded to DNASolves yet, and because I was since I'm in Sweden, would that help? And would perhaps Swedish law enforcement be allowed to search in the database, or is it just for law enforcement in the US?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we work with law enforcement if it's a legitimate law enforcement investigation. We haven't done anything in Sweden. I mean, our primary growth right now has been in the United States. There are occasionally requests from Canada. So I think that's where, and if you look at the databases, they're heavily dominated by Northern European samples, many of which originate from the United States. So I think all data is good data, but I think you have a good point. Like, I don't think we have a critical mass of data to solve every crime in Sweden, for example. I think that it's going to take time, but I think in time, I think that as we have more data and more comparison data points, I think that there will be value in doing that. So I certainly advocate. I certainly think that if you want to, no one should be pushed out of their comfort zone, but if you want to make a difference and you feel like that's the right choice for you to help law enforcement maybe uncover the next set of unidentified remains, then I think it's always great to do. I mean, there are folks that are unidentified here in the States who may have origins overseas, right? And maybe very recent origins overseas. So it still is beneficial, but I just don't know enough about what's going on, for example, in Sweden or in any European country to know how valuable or not GEDmatch or any other database would be. I mean, I think the data is primarily dominated by Americans.
Yeah. Well, I just gonna fill you in on that because it's a really hot topic in Sweden. Because last week the first case was actually, they found a suspect. It was a double murder 16 years ago.
Wow.
And it was a little kid, I think he was 8 years old. He was stabbed, and there came out a woman to try to stop it, and she was stabbed as well, and she died on the hospital.
Oh, no.
And and they had the knife with the murder's DNA on it, and they found his hat like 100 meters away, so they could match it. And they have been trying to solve this for like 16 years.
Wow.
And last year they decided that this would be one of the pilot projects for doing genetic genealogy with law enforcement. And I think it took about 2 months after the upload to Family Tree DNA. Last week they made the arrest in the morning. They took his DNA, and it matched the crime scene. And in the afternoon he had confessed that he did it. So this is a very hot topic in Sweden right now. It's been all over the news for
that's incredible.
week. Yeah. So that was the pilot project, and there's also another project where they are trying to identify a man that died, or he was murdered. He was found in, I think, 2003, not very far from where I lived. So I have been following this case before it even came this pilot project, but he is probably from Croatia, so they have to cooperate with the Croatian police, and I think they have found about 3 men that are reported missing that they are looking into to see if he is one of them. So that's the 2 projects that has been going on in Sweden in this, and this all started after Golden State Killer, and the law enforcement understood that this is something we can use as well with commercial databases, DNA databases. So
yeah, I think that's incredible. I saw some news out of Australia just recently, and they're looking into both genetic genealogy, but even just familial search with existing STR markers. And I think this is going to transform, solving again what otherwise would be unsolvable crimes. So it's exciting that it's already been used successfully in Sweden. It looks like folks as far out as Australia, everywhere, are beginning to look at this technology. We're based in the United States, so we have our hands full with the United States cases, but if anyone at the law enforcement in Sweden is watching your show, we'll help them out as well. So we want to try to bring as many cold cases to resolution as possible. There's at least a couple 100,000 unidentified folks here in the United States, and a good number of them have evidence. They have DNA. They have some kind of maybe it's skeletal remains, but there's some material from which we could probably develop a profile. And I just think I almost feel like it's an obligation, if we have technology that can bring a value there, then we should find the right way to do it. Of course, it needs to be funded. It needs to be done in a way that is ethical and appropriate. But it seems almost irresponsible to have technology that could answer these questions that time and money has been spent to answer unsuccessfully, and then not apply it. So I do want to find ways to grow the adoption of the technology. We're obviously very serious about it. We like I said, we're the only ones that so far have vertically integrated the entire process, and I would love to see it be used more widely to solve some of these older cases of unknown identity or terrible violent crimes that have just gone unworked because they've run out of the leads, or there wasn't enough evidence to move things forward.
Yeah,
so it's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. And you're also starting a magazine, right?
Oh, so we have I was asked to be the editor-in-chief of a new academic journal. So this is, I guess, it's like they say, once you're an academic, you're always an academic, and you cannot escape your past. So I think one really important thing, we talked about a lot of stuff. A lot of people want to get into this space. Like all areas of science, there has to be a solid foundation of scientific research, reviewed by your peers, validated and vetted, and that constant layering of lots of people working together to build science, refine it, improve methods, whether on the lab or on the computer. That's what leads to technology that can be robust, accurate, and deployable to the masses. And that all starts in the university, or at least in the research setting. And so Marianne Liebert, she runs one of the large publishing houses. She had this idea for a new journal, and the journal is going to be called Forensic Genomics. First journal of its kind, because there's journals that look at genetic testing in the context of forensics, but they're centered around mitochondrial analysis and CODIS testing. Then, of course, there's lots of genomics journals, but the genomics journals are centered around methods and medicine and things that are not necessarily forensic in nature. So Marianne Liebert had this great idea to build a journal that would unite folks that are experts in genetics and in genomics technique, and marry that to forensics, people that have spent years working with very old, whether it's ancient DNA, whether it's forensic old samples, and put those all people together and essentially cross-pollinate those fields. And that cross-pollination, which is what I have on my team, is what's enabled us to do this kind of work. So we figure we build a journal, people can publish research that would be applicable on both sides of these fields. There's a lot of fields, and there's forensics, there's anthropology, and a lot of our projects we work with anthropologists that bring very valuable perspectives from their end. So integrating genealogy, anthropology, forensic science, genomics, computer science, mathematics to model, what we know about, true human populations and their variation. Integrating all of that together to do something really amazing like this is a really exciting thing. So anyways, Marianne Liebert was working on this. Also over at that journal is Kevin Davis, who, unless you're an academic, publishing nerd like myself, you may not know he was the founding editor of Nature Genetics in the 90s. And so the two of them are really great, and they wanted to put this journal together. So I'm the editor-in-chief of that journal. We're going to launch a preview issue at the end of this year, and then hope to aggressively grow that journal next year. And we have some pretty great people on our board, both from the universities and also from companies that are currently engaged in forensic testing. So it's very exciting. I'm super excited about the journal, and if anyone is listening that is a student or a postdoc or a professor or someone that just likes to do research, but usually it's going to be the university folks. We want it's a worldwide journal, so So we're looking for input everywhere. Our board includes people from everywhere around the world. But yeah, I'm very excited about that. I think I want to do anything I can to help kind of grow this field. And I think there's a lot of ways to grow it. There's the laboratory work, and that's why we have Othram. There's DNASolves, GEDmatch, and other databases. There's the whole field of research that needs to materialize. Maybe it's in these journals that we will develop better and more cost-effective techniques that allow us to bring this to consumers, to, as we talked about, to museum curators. I think the opportunities for exploring things with DNA testing are limitless. Maybe you saw the article about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they're using DNA testing to kind of join fragments together. I mean, there are really a lot of interesting applications of using DNA testing to ID people or to understand artifacts and reveal historical stories that are kind of locked away and inaccessible to us. So I think that whole area is fascinating, and I couldn't be more thrilled to help get this journal going. So yeah, that's my sales pitch for forensic genomics. Should be launching at the end of the year. We're very excited about it.
Yeah, sounds really great. So this is time flies when we're having fun. So I'm going to ask you a couple of more questions. And the first one is, do you have a favorite app or program or tool that you use when I know you don't do that much genealogy, but to organize everything?
So I will tell you, probably not a surprise to anyone. I really like Johnny Pearl, and I like DNA Painter. I think it's amazing. I think some of this newer stuff, Watto, right? What are the odds to be able to look at a relationship on a tree and assess, based on the shared sentiment Morgan project, whether or not these are plausible or likely scenarios. I think those are exciting. I mean, it's and then one day that'll probably be automated. So you start to conceive of trees up front that have a likely chance of existing. I think that's really exciting because it accelerates the journey for people that want to learn about their own family history, but also these puzzles centered around unidentified remains. But I particularly like DNA Painter because, especially in the sciences, it's always hard to find good tool. You can find good tools, but it's hard to find good tools with a nice user experience. And I feel maybe it's because Johnny Pearl has a background in web development, but he just builds really great interfaces. It's a pleasure to use his stuff. I love it, and so I like what he's done, and I like a lot of the other recent tools that have come up. Obviously, from a value point of view, GEDmatch has been a very valuable, indispensable tool. But I love the user interface for DNA Painter. I love all this new stuff that tries to make automatic recommendations like Watto, and I'm excited to kind of see how things evolve. I know a lot of companies have been investing time into trying to automatically build trees or make recommendations. I think that's a fascinating area of research, and that's a really good area that I would love to see explored in a journal, because again, aside from trying to get more data and more people involved in sharing data, the next best thing you can do, I think, is just to build good quality tools. I don't have a good tool. Maybe you have a recommendation for me. I actually don't have a good tool for just managing the project. I don't know what people use. Seems like we use GEDmatch, DNA Painter. We've got some trees from here, records, Excel sheets. So I don't know if there's you could ask a more seasoned genealogist if there's like the perfect tool to kind of create the virtual notebook that has all your notes. That would be great. Maybe someone can build it. Maybe Johnny Pearl can build it.
Yeah, hopefully.
I'm sure he has.
I don't think that tool exists yet. That's why I tried to ask every guest what their favorite is.
Yeah, we should petition someone that has good design sense like Johnny to go build it. So, if I had design sense, I would build it, but I don't have that skill. I'm a one-trick pony. I just stick to DNA testing.
So, could you share something about you that most people don't know about you?
I don't know. I like to sail, so I don't think I've ever said that online. My dad and I have been since I was a little kid. We raced sailboats, so I like sailing. So that's something that's not DNA testing related.
Yeah, That's nice. So actually, I also have a question from last week's guest, and I will play it for you.
Okay.
And let's see where we have it, and you will see.
So my question to you, if you could pick somebody you've researched that's no longer here, that by talking to them would solve the problem of what you're researching, who would it be and why? And if you could pick an ancestor in your own genealogy that you never met, who would you talk to and what would you ask them? That would be my question for you.
I always get the hard questions. Yeah, I don't do a lot of exploratory work in genealogy. So I don't know that there's a historical figure that I would reach out to. I don't know a lot about my family history. My family immigrated, as I had said, to the States, and so I would love to talk to anyone really in my extended family generations back, just to find out, where we started off in Europe, how we made the detour to Russia, and how we ended up in the United States. I think I would be curious to know more. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know a lot about my family history. I think everyone who's worked a case in genealogy has kind of maybe daydreamed. So on the forensic side, I certainly have just daydreamed about trying to want to know, what happened at a scene. You're looking at, remains, someone that was, obviously died before their time and is essentially vanished from the record unless you can sort their identity back out. So I guess from that sense, although I don't work on historical or genealogical puzzles, I sometimes wish I could just, call them up and figure out what was going on, what happened right before they ended up missing. So, but yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that's
a good answer. Thank you very much. And now you will get the chance to ask the question to the next guest.
I can punish the next guest.
Yes, that's your reward.
Question. I'm always curious. I got into this field because from a young age I was just very fascinated in DNA and what DNA could tell us about our personal stories, whether historical, medical, or otherwise. And so I guess my question for the next speaker would be, what brought you into the world of genealogy or genetics or DNA testing, and how did you get into this field originally? So for me, I came in from the DNA side and eventually learned an interest in genealogy, but I'd be curious how others jumped into the space. So it's an exciting area, but it's not super large. And so it's always interesting to know. You should tell me how you got into this. How did you get into this?
Me? Well, I started doing genealogy in 2007, and it was an evening, and my parents said, we started doing genealogy research. And I said, wow, interesting. And I stayed at their house until midnight. Then I went home, opened my computer, and thought to myself, I need to get done with this tonight. And at 4 a.m., I realized that I better go to sleep. I will probably not finish this tonight. And I'm still doing it. And then in 2013, I took a DNA test, and I discovered after a while that my paternal grandfather was not my biological grandfather. Oh. It was a family secret. And I decided that I want to solve this, and I want to find out who he was. So that's why I got so much into DNA and tried to learn every tool and figure out how will I find out who he was, what tools can I use, what do I need to learn, and I found him. So that's how I got into it. And if everything was like expected, I probably wouldn't have just said, yeah, it seems correct, and I probably wouldn't have got so deep into DNA. But then I discovered this is the absolutely most fun thing I can do. So now, since I started my company, and I do it full time, so.
I do think this is the most exciting aspect to DNA work, is to help push an investigation, whether it's your personal investigation or a formal one. Just push it over the barrier when you get stuck. A little bit of DNA testing can just push you and give you just enough facts to move forward, and that's the most rewarding thing. That's that could happen, I think. So that's why I love this space as well.
Yeah. So then I want to thank everyone that's been watching and also says she wants your job. She probably thinks it's very exciting what you do. And
come to Houston.
Yeah.
We're in Texas.
Yeah, sounds great. So thank you for everyone watching, and thank you very much for being my guest today. And I will play the outro, and that is my grandmother singing, and we will finish with that. So have a nice day, everyone.
Vad gör det att skymningen bredar sitt flor, hon är tankarnas vän? Vad gör det att solen går neder då den kommer i morgon igen?